Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
As we do these series, there are certain episodes that become the centerpiece of that series. The point on which the entire series rests, where the argument is made. In some series, it happens in the middle or near the end. In this series, a series of 20 episodes, it is here, now, in episode 3. This is that critical episode. This is the point where everything changes. This is where American empire is born and why we look to these events to make our arguments for and against. This is the episode. If you watch no other episodes, if you listen to no other episodes in the series, let it be this one. Let it be this one to understand why we are where we are today. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and start with the cold open. In January 1898, the United States was a continental republic with no overseas colonies, a small professional military, and a foreign policy that would have been recognizable to Thomas Jefferson. By December of that same year, America possessed an empire spanning the Caribbean and the Pacific. It was engaged in colonial warfare against Filipino independence fighters. It had announced itself to the world as a great power with global interests. The transformation took 10 months. We call it the Spanish-American War, a name that obscures as much as it reveals. The war with Spain lasted barely 4 months and cost fewer than 400 American combat deaths. Secretary of State John Hay called it a splendid little war. But the war that followed, the Philippine-American War, the war we rarely discuss, lasted more than a decade and killed hundreds of thousands of Filipinos. It employed methods that Americans had condemned when Spain used them: reconcentration camps, torture, the systematic destruction of villages, and orders to kill everyone over the age of 10. Senator Albert Beveridge of Indiana explained the purpose clearly. We have about 10% more products than we can consume. We've got to find a market for the excess. The Philippines are ours forever. And just beyond the Philippines are China's illimitable markets. We will not retreat from either. We will not renounce our part in the mission of our race, trustee, under God, of the civilization of the world. Ugh. Commerce, Christianity, civilization, the holy trinity of empire. This is what 1898 was actually about. Not the humanitarian rescue, not Spanish atrocities, power. The belief that America's destiny required dominion over others. Today, we examine the year that everything changed, when the founders' foreign policy was abandoned, not refuted, when the arguments against empire were shouted down, not answered. When America chose a path that Jefferson, Washington, and Madison had warned would lead to the corruption of the republic itself. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions podcast. This is episode 3 of the series, Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements from the Founders to the Forever Wars. Today, Serving Commerce, 1898, and the birth of American empire. This episode corresponds to Article 3 of our written series, published last Sunday on our Substack page. And a note before we begin. This episode includes discussion of wartime atrocities, including torture and killing of civilians. It also involves abhorrent, explicit racist quotes and racial superiority themes prevalent at the times. These events are historically documented. They deserve to be remembered and condemned. As always, this podcast expands on themes from the article, provides additional primary sources, and addresses complexities that the written form cannot fully explore. So with that said, let us begin. To understand 1898, we must first understand what was actually happening in Cuba and what the American people were told what was happening. Spain's New World Empire had shrunk dramatically by the 1890s. Cuba remained sugar-rich, strategically positioned, 90 miles from Florida, and increasingly restless under colonial control. Cuban grievances were genuine. Spanish colonial administration was extractive and repressive. A 10-year independence war had ended in exhaustion in 1878. By 1895, a new insurgency had erupted, led by Jose Marti and several other independence fighters. The Spanish response was brutal. Their commanding general implemented a policy called Reconcentration, essentially herding rural populations into fortified camps to deny support to insurgents. The camps were overcrowded, undersupplied, and rife with disease. Estimates suggest that 100,000 to 400,000 Cubans died from disease, malnutrition, and neglect. Spanish conduct was indefensible by any humanitarian standard. The atrocities were real. Critics of American intervention are sometimes accused of denying Spanish cruelty. I am not denying it. Spain was behaving badly. But the questions that should always be asked is not whether simply atrocities occurred. The questions are, was American intervention the appropriate response? Were the methods used justified? And did the actual consequences serve Cuban interest or American imperial ambitions? Because American interest in Cuba was not purely humanitarian. Approximately $50 million in American capital was invested in Cuban sugar. The island's proximity to proposed canal routes also gave it strategic significance. American businesses wanted stability, and some wanted annexation. But more immediately, the Cuban insurgency provided spectacular copy for the American press. Stories that blurred the line between reporting and advocacy. Historians now call it yellow journalism. As an aside, the Yellow Kid, a kid wearing a yellow shirt, he was a populist comic from tenement life and the source for the term yellow journalism, a term that came to symbolize a sales bonanza in print media. William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World were engaged in a circulation war. Cuban atrocities, real and embellished, sold newspapers. Lurid illustrations, inflammatory headlines. And then there was this apocryphal exchange, which was attributed to Hearst, and it captures the dynamic. The artist, Frederick Remington, supposedly cabled from Cuba that there was just no war to photograph. And Hearst allegedly responded, "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." The quotation is probably invented, but the dynamic it describes was entirely real. The press did not create American interest in Cuba, but it amplified and inflamed it. By early 1898, public opinion was primed for intervention. What was needed was an incident. On January 25th, 1898, the battleship USS Maine arrived in Havana Harbor. The official explanation was protection of American citizens and interests. The implicit message to Spain was unmistakable. The United States was watching. On the evening of February 15th, an explosion tore through the Maine, sinking the ship and killing 266 American soldiers. The cause was unknown. The American press didn't wait for investigation. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy, screamed the New York Journal. Remember the Maine became the rallying cry. A naval court of inquiry was convened. It was completed in less than a month. Its members were not explosive experts. They examined the wreckage under difficult conditions and with limited time. Their conclusion? External mine. And that fit the prevailing narrative and satisfied public demand for a culprit. Whether it fit the evidence is another matter entirely. Spain vigorously denied responsibility, and Spain had every reason to tell the truth. Spanish authorities knew that war with the United States would be catastrophic for their already crumbling empire. They had no conceivable motive to attack an American warship in their own harbor. If anyone had reason to sink the Maine, it was Cuban insurgents seeking to draw America into their fight, or perhaps American interests seeking the same outcome. Spain offered to submit the matter to international arbitration. The offer was refused. Modern investigations, most notably 1976 study by Admiral Hyman Rickover and a 1998 National Geographic analysis, both concluded that the explosion was likely internal. Probably a coal bunker fire ignited when ignited the ship's ammunition magazines. You see, the ship's ammunition and the coal bunker were side by side. This created, it was a design flaw, and it created a scenario where this could commonly happen. These types of catastrophic accidents, entirely plausible. Now, whether Spain was responsible was never established. And what was established was that the United States didn't wait to find out. The machinery of war was already in motion. Here's what makes this pattern so instructive for us now. In the weeks following the explosion, Spain made significant concessions. It offered an armistice in Cuba. It agreed to close the reconcentration camps. It indicated willingness to grant Cuban autonomy. By early April, Spain had effectively capitulated to American demands. But these concessions were insufficient for the war party. President McKinley, personally inclined towards peace, faced enormous pressure from Congress, the press, and his own party. On April 11th, he sent a war message to Congress that barely mentioned Spain's concessions. And on April 25th, Congress declared war. The Spanish-American War was brief, victorious, and for Americans, relatively bloodless. It made heroes and launched political careers. It seemed to vindicate those who had clamored for intervention. Naval victory came swiftly. On May 1st, Commodore George Dewey's Asiatic Squadron destroyed the Spanish Pacific Fleet at Manila Bay. It did so in hours. American casualties were minimal. Dewey became an instant national hero. And yes, in case you're wondering, Admiral Dewey was a distant cousin of Thomas Dewey, who would be the future New York governor and 1944 GOP presidential candidate. But back to the war. In Cuba, the campaign was messier but equally decisive. Theodore Roosevelt resigned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to lead the Rough Riders, which was a volunteer cavalry regiment. Think about that now. Assistant Secretary to the Navy resigning to volunteer to ride horseback on a tropical island for close contact battle. The assault on San Juan Hill, actually Kettle Hill, became legend. Whatever the tactical realities, it became legend. By mid-July, Spanish forces in Cuba had surrendered. American combat deaths totaled approximately 400. Disease killed about 10 times as many, a reminder of the realities of tropical warfare. But for the American public, the war was a triumph. Swift, glorious, and cheap. Secretary of State John Hay called it a splendid little war, begun with the highest motives, carried on with magnificent intelligence and spirit, favored by that fortune which loves the brave. Spain sued for peace in August. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, transferred to the United States Puerto Rico, Guam, and crucially, the Philippines. Cuba was granted nominal independence. Nominal. The Platt Amendment, attached as a condition of American withdrawal, required Cuba to lease naval bases to the United States. It limited Cuba's ability to incur debt or make treaties with foreign powers and listen to this language, gave the United States the right to intervene for the preservation of Cuban independence or the maintenance of a government adequate to the protection of life, property, and individual liberty. In other words, Cuba was independent, but subject to American intervention whenever American officials judged intervention necessary. This was not the liberation that the Teller Amendment had promised. That amendment, attached to the war declaration itself, had pledged that the United States would not annex Cuba. So Congress kept to the letter of that promise, but it violated its spirit completely. For the Philippines, the United States paid Spain $20 million, not for Philippine consent, which was neither sought nor given, for Spanish renunciation of sovereignty over a people who had been fighting for their own independence. And here the constitutional problem became unavoidable. The Constitution provided no template for permanent colonies. The founders had not even contemplated an American empire. Now the nation had one, and no one was quite sure what the rules were. The Philippines presented a problem the Teller Amendment, the amendment that said we wouldn't annex the lands, it tried to avoid. The Philippines had 7,000 islands, 7 million people, and were halfway around the world. Filipinos had their own views on the matter. They'd been fighting for independence from Spain before American intervention. Emilio Aguinaldo's independence forces had cooperated with Dewey's fleet, understanding themselves as American allies against a common enemy. They expected, not unreasonably, that victory would bring the independence they had been fighting for. After all, this was the Americans, the original independence fighters. President McKinley's explanation of how he decided to annex the Philippines became infamous. He recounted it to a delegation of Methodist church leaders, and he said, "I walked the floor of the White House night after night until midnight, and I'm not ashamed to tell you, gentlemen, that I went down on my knees and prayed Almighty God for light and guidance more than one night. And one night late it came to me this way, that there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them." The irony was not lost on McKinley. The Philippines had been Christian, Catholic, for 300 years under Spanish rule. What they lacked was not Christianity. What they lacked was independence. Now, the Treaty of Paris, the way this works, the Treaty of Paris was signed in December, but it needs to be ratified by 2/3 vote in the Senate. And this was not assured. The Anti-Imperialist League, which we'll examine shortly, mobilized opposition. And so the treaty's fate remained uncertain through January 1899. William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic standard bearer and opponent of the empire, made a fateful choice. He urged Democratic senators to go ahead and ratify the treaty, arguing this would end the war and it would allow the question of Philippine independence to be decided democratically in the 1900 election. Again, logistically, the war ended with the Treaty of Paris in December 1898. But under United States constitutional law, that treaty needs to be ratified by the Senate. The Teller Amendment at the beginning of the war stated that we would not annex these territories. However, in the Treaty of Paris, we're paying $20 million to Spain and annexing the Philippines. So several senators were on the fence about signing this treaty. And the Anti-Imperialist League was championing not to sign this because we were not to take on the Philippines as an annexed territory. William Jennings Bryan, who was the standard bearer for the Democrats and an anti-imperialist himself, said, what we need to do is go ahead and ratify the treaty, and then the question of Philippine independence will be decided on the ballot, because during the next election, Bryan was running against McKinley. And that would dictate the popular support for not annexing the Philippines, in his opinion. That was the strategy. And the strategy backfired catastrophically. The treaty was ratified on February 6, 1899, by a margin of 2 votes. Bryan's hope of fighting imperialism at the ballot box came to nothing. He lost the 1900 election to McKinley. The acquisition was legitimized, and the window for reversal was closed. Let's talk a little bit about why. 2 days before the Senate ratified the treaty, February, war erupted between American forces and Filipino independence fighters. And that became a war that would last officially until 1902 and effectively until 1913. It would claim far more lives than the Spanish-American War itself, and would end up employing these methods that the Americans had condemned when Spain had used them. The Spanish-American Splendid Little War became an early harbinger of a different mission accomplished rhetoric from over a century later, and it would bring similar results. A long, drawn-out affair of insurgency and nation building. The conventional military operations in this war, the Philippine-American War, ended relatively quickly. The American military advantage was overwhelming. By late 1899, Aguinaldo's forces had been defeated, and the independence leader had retreated to guerrilla warfare. Now, the guerrilla phase was another matter entirely. Filipino resistance proved tenacious, aided by terrain, popular support, and the same factors that would bedevil American counterinsurgency efforts for the next century and a quarter. American forces controlled the towns, but the countryside, after dark, belonged to the guerrillas. Unable to defeat the insurgency through conventional means, American commanders turned to methods they had once condemned when Spain employed them. The reconcentration policy, the very practice that had outraged American opinion and provided moral justification for intervention in Cuba, was adopted under a different terminology. You see, rural populations were concentrated into controlled zones, and food supplies to insurgent areas were destroyed, and the countryside made uninhabitable. Then there was the water cure. This was a form of torture, later be called waterboarding, and it was used in investigations. A Senate investigation documented the practice. This is a little graphic. Water was forced into the stomach until the victim's abdomen was grotesquely distended. followed by pressure on the abdomen to expel the water. The process repeated until information was extracted or the victim died. American soldiers testified to employing this method. Officers acknowledged it occurred. The practice was neither secret nor particularly controversial at the time. The victims were, after all, savages resisting American benevolence. The logic of counterinsurgency drove escalation. When guerrillas operated with popular support, the population itself became the target. Villages suspected of harboring insurgents were burned. Livestock was slaughtered. Crops were destroyed. The strategy had a name: chastisement. Its purpose was to make the cost of resistance so high that the population would abandon the insurgents. General Jacob Smith, commanding operations on the island of Samar, after a guerrilla attack killed American soldiers, he issued orders that became notorious. I want no prisoners. I wish you to kill and burn. The more you kill and burn, the better it will please me. The interior of Samar must be made a howling wilderness. Asked to clarify the age limit for killing, Smith allegedly replied, 10 years. Smith was court-martialed. He was convicted of conduct to the prejudice of good order and military discipline. He was forced to retire. He was not charged with war crimes. The punishment for ordering the killing of children was loss of employment. The message was clear. The methods might be regrettable, but the mission would continue. Estimates of Filipino deaths vary enormously, from 200,000 to over 1 million. And the variance is due to the different methodologies that historians use to count the deaths. But know this, most deaths were not from combat, but war-related famine and disease, as they are in most wars. The population of the Philippines declined measurably during the American occupation. And for comparison, approximately 4,200 American soldiers died in the Philippine-American War. And again, most of those from disease. The ratio of Filipino to American death tells its own story about who bore the cost of benevolent assimilation. There's a myth to the opposition to American empire has always been marginal. The province of radicals, isolationists, ranks. The historical record says otherwise. The Anti-Imperialist League was founded in June 1898, before the war with Spain had concluded. It was founded to oppose the annexation of the Philippines, and it was not a fringe movement. It was a substantial coalition of American elites. Members included former President Grover Cleveland, the one we spoke about in the last episode, who had refused to annex Hawaii based on principle. It also included Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, who I have an affinity to here from Pittsburgh. He funded League activities and argued that empire was economically irrational. And Mark Twain, he lent his literary genius to the cause, producing savage satires of imperial pretension. Even Samuel Gompers of the American Federation of Labor opposed annexation on behalf of American workers who feared competition from colonial labor. Academics, clergy, reformers, industrialists, labor leaders. At its peak, the League claimed perhaps 500,000 to 1 million members or supporters. Their arguments, of which I will list in some detail, deserve attention because they were not answered. They were merely overwhelmed, propagandized against, or plain lied about. Both then in the press and subsequently, unfortunately, in scholastic history books that you and I grew up with. I guess their aim was to color the events and portray imperial-leaning leaders of that time as something they were not. Benevolent. Let's start with the basics. The constitutional argument. The Constitution, anti-imperialists argued, did not contemplate permanent colonies with subject populations. The founding document spoke of self-government, consent of the governed, and the rights of man. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed principles it called self-evident and universal. How could a republic founded on these principles hold colonies of people denied representation, denied citizenship, and denied the rights Americans claim for themselves? Senator George Orr of Massachusetts put the question directly. You have no right at the cannon's mouth to impose to an unwilling people your Declaration of Independence and your Constitution and your notions of freedom and notions of what is good. The Constitution provided for territories to become states. It did not provide for permanent subject territories because the founders had not envisioned an American empire. The precedent of holding such territories, anti-imperialists warned, would corrupt American institutions. How about the economic argument? Free trade, it didn't require political control. If American businesses wanted to access the Philippine markets, they could trade with an independent Philippines as they traded with other nations. Colonial administration was expensive. Military occupation, civil government, the infrastructure of empire all required appropriations that American taxpayers would have to fund. The Philippines would be a drain, not a source of wealth. Think about that. This was before the income tax. Think back to the other series. We talk about the General Welfare Clause. We talk about when that came to be. What we have leading up to that in this counterinsurgency through 1913, a very bad year, by the way, for the United States. What we have building up to that is all of this cost that we are incurring. William Graham Sumner, the Yale sociologist, delivered the most famous economic critique in an essay titled The Conquest of the United States by Spain. He wrote, "We have beaten Spain in a military conflict, but we are submitting to be conquered by her on the field of ideas and policies. Expansionism and imperialism are nothing but the old philosophies of national prosperity which have brought Spain to where she now is." Understand what Sumner's saying? The Spanish Empire had made Spain poor, not rich. Its colonies had required endless military expenditure to acquire and maintain. They had diverted resources from productive investment. They had corrupted Spanish institutions with the habits of colonial administration. Spain was a declining power precisely because it had pursued empire. Now America proposed to follow the same path. The moral argument was the simplest and most fundamental. People have rights. Those rights do not depend on race, religion, or civilization. Filipinos had the same natural rights as Americans, including the right to not be ruled by foreigners against their will. Hell, we fought a revolution over it. Mark Twain wrote of his ideology, "It should, it seems to me, be our pleasure and duty to make those people free and let them deal with their own domestic questions in their own way. And so, I am an anti-imperialist. I am opposed to having the eagle put its talons on any other land. The Christian missionaries who supported annexation claimed they were bringing salvation. Twain replied with the war prayer, a devastating satire in which a congregation prays for victory and a stranger reveals the unspoken content of their prayer. Help us to tear their soldiers to bloody shreds with our shells. Help us to wring the hearts of their unoffending widows with unavailing grief. Help us to lay waste their humble homes with a hurricane of fire. That piece was too bitter for publication in Twain's lifetime. And then the strategic argument. The Philippines, anti-imperialists warned, would be strategically indefensible. The archipelago lay thousands of miles from American shores, adjacent to rising powers with interests of their own. Defending the Philippines would require permanent military presence, naval bases, and entanglement in Asian rivalries that were no concern of the United States. The argument proved prophetic. The Philippines became the vulnerability the Japanese strategists targeted in December 1941. The islands fell after desperate resistance. American prisoners endured the Bataan Death March. The strategic liability the anti-imperialists predicted materialized exactly as they had warned 40 years later. So why did they lose? The anti-imperialists lost despite the quality of their arguments. War fever made opposition appear disloyal. Remember the timing. The treaty was signed in December. It was up for ratification in January and February. William Jennings Bryan made the gamble, asked the senators to go ahead and approve the treaty, thinking that over the course of the next year, there would be a political battle about the annexation of the Philippines, and he would win the popular support and win the presidential election, and then therefore not annex the Philippines. That was his mindset. But war fever made opposition appear disloyal. Once American soldiers were fighting and dying in the Philippines, which again started 2 days before the actual signing of the document, of the ratification in February. William Jennings Bryan did not anticipate us to go to war with the Philippine insurgents during that entire period. And once American soldiers were fighting and dying in the Philippines, criticism of the war seemed like criticism of the soldiers. To question the acquisition was to question the valor of those who had won it. And then the anti-imperialists were labeled as traitors, cowards, pro-Spanish. The usual vocabulary deployed against those who question wars in progress. Again, does any of that sound familiar now? And racism provided a convenient rationalization. Many Americans simply did not believe Filipinos capable of self-government. They looked different, so they were little brown brothers who needed American tutelage, perhaps indefinitely. And then commercial interests mobilized very effectively. Both political parties' leadership supported expansion, other than Bryan. The anti-imperialists had eloquent voices, but they lost their political vehicle. In Bryan's blunder, urging ratification to fight the issue electorally, it ended up legitimizing the acquisition at the crucial moment. Once the treaty was ratified and the war had begun, reversal became nearly impossible. Filipinos were dying, American soldiers were dying, prestige was engaged. To withdraw would be to admit error. And no politician wishes to admit error. The fait accompli prevailed, as fait accomplis generally do. No one embodied the new imperial ideology more completely than Theodore Roosevelt. His political career was launched by the Spanish-American War. The Rough Riders, San Juan Hill, the image of vigorous American manhood triumphant. Governor of New York, then vice president. Then upon McKinley's assassination in 1901, he became the youngest president in American history, just 42 years old. His presidency would articulate the vision that would guide American policy for generations. Roosevelt's philosophy was one of strenuous nationalism. Nations, like individuals, proved their worth through struggle. Softness invited contempt. Vigor commanded respect. I should welcome almost any war, Roosevelt had written in 1897, for I think this country needs one. The sentiment was not ironic. War built character. It unified nations. It separated the virile from the decadent. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, announced in 1904, transformed Europe stay out into America intervenes at will. Where Monroe had warned European powers against colonizing the Western Hemisphere, Roosevelt announced that the United States would exercise international police power in Latin America whenever instability threatened or nations failed to meet their obligations. Again, sound familiar? This was not the founders' foreign policy. It was the opposite. Washington had warned against foreign entanglement. Roosevelt entangled vigorously. Jefferson had counseled commerce with all, alliances with none. Roosevelt proclaimed American primacy and the duty to enforce it. Madison had warned war concentrates power. Roosevelt celebrated that concentration. Roosevelt's policies drew on international intellectual currents that had been building for decades. Alfred Thayer Mann's The Influence of Sea Power Upon History argued that national greatness required naval supremacy, and naval supremacy required bases and coaling stations around the world. Social Darwinism applied survival of the fittest to nations. Empires that did not expand would be surpassed by those who did. Anglo-Saxonism held that English-speaking peoples had special gifts for governance and civilizing missions that they needed to discharge. Rudyard Kipling addressed the white man's burden specifically to Americans contemplating the Philippines. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. The poem urged imperial responsibility as duty, not merely interest. The civilized races were obligated to uplift the savage, however ungrateful the recipients might be. Commerce, Christianity, civilization. The merger of commercial interest and imperial ideology was complete. America would pursue markets, but would justify the pursuit in terms of uplift and benevolence. And the pattern would persist. What did 1898 mean? The transformation was comprehensive. America acquired permanent overseas colonies with subject populations, people who were neither citizens nor aliens, governed without consent, ruled by American power without American rights. America committed to great power competition in regions far from its shores, creating interests that would require defense and entanglements that would demand attention for the next century. The executive gained power to deploy forces globally, to acquire territory, to govern colonial possessions with minimal congressional oversight. The Imperial Presidency had its origins here. The military establishment expanded permanently. The small professional army of the Continental Republic gave way to an institution capable of projecting power across oceans. The ideology shifted from Republican restraint to national greatness, from the founder's suspicion of power to Roosevelt's celebration of it. And what was lost? The founders' foreign policy, the principles of their policy, was abandoned, not refuted. Washington's warnings against foreign entanglement, Jefferson's counsel of peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, Madison's analysis of how war corrupts republics, these were not answered. They were dismissed as obsolete, outgrown, inapplicable to a rising power with global interests. The anti-imperialist arguments were not answered but overwhelmed. The constitutional objections, the economic analysis, the moral critique, the strategic warnings, none never received adequate response. They were shouted down by war fever and then forgotten. The connection between expansion and constitutional decay that Madison warned of becomes visible. War concentrated power. Empire required standing military forces. The executive gained at the expense of Congress. The trajectory the founders feared had begun. And yet, the counter tradition survived. It's why this series exists. And it's why we sit here today together on this podcast, reviewing history with a critical gaze. Anti-imperialism did not disappear. It went underground. It would resurface in opposition to World War I, when the old right warned against European entanglement. It would animate the American First Movement before World War II. It would find expression in the libertarian critique of Cold War interventionism. The tradition from William Graham Sumner through Robert Taft, through to Ron Paul and Thomas Massie is continuous. Its arguments are the founders' arguments, adapted to change circumstances, but unchanged in essence. That republics cannot sustain empire, that foreign entanglement corrupts domestic liberty, that war is the health of the state and the enemy of freedom. Tomorrow, in Article 4, we will examine the Great Game and the road to Armageddon, the European imperial system, the web of alliances and rivalries that Washington warned against, and how a single assassination in Sarajevo produced the catastrophic World War I. But coming up on Tuesday, we'll come back to these themes, and we'll release a contemporary application episode examining how the patterns of 1898, the manufactured predicate, humanitarian rhetoric masking commercial interests, the marginalization of critics, continue to shape American foreign policy today. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been episode 3 of Empire of Liberty, America's foreign entanglements from the founders to the forever wars, on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com. where you will find all written articles as well as previous series on the General Welfare Clause and the New Leviathan. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes, and follow me on X at jkellig for updates, discussions, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until next time, have a great day.